I've been following this subject for about 25 years in different ways and constantly have hope that some new understanding will penetrate and that more sensible policies will be pursued. And I feel that an event like this really does have a chance of making a difference, especially as it's being filmed and will be accessible on the internet after a while, so that interested parties are going to be able to learn from a lot of very good speakers who are lined up in this next 2 days. I'd just like to outline the ground that I want to cover. I'm going to describe the situation very briefly as I see it today, I think in a way that everybody would agree with it, then some problems associated with that, and then I want to look at where I think the root of those problems lies. On the one hand, in terms of the science, some fundamental mistakes that were made with regard to the HIV test and what it means, and secondly, in more social and cultural terms, fitting in very nicely, I hope, with the ideas that Uta shared with you just now. I found those insights from Fleck especially useful, and funnily enough, my understanding of the relevance of Goethe's Faust to this story came from some quotes from Humberto Maturana, whom she quoted at the end of her talk. So we have here in Vienna the International AIDS Conference, thousands meeting to discuss a syndrome in which collapse of the immune system, defenses against certain common infections, can lead to illness and death. That's the situation. And there are many problems associated with this situation. One is that drugs that can act against those infections, but it is also generally acknowledged that it's not clearing the underlying causes of the disease. And a consequence of that is that, taken over a long period, problems like liver disease and other problems associated with the drugs are actually becoming causes of ill health and death in their own right. And you're going to be hearing more about that during this 2 days. In the absence of a cure, it's considered to be a risk worth taking, but that's something that I think will be questioned at this meeting. Another problem is that there's a mismatch between the idea that the world is in the grip of a virus new to humanity and predictions based on that theory, that it was going to affect everybody who was sexually active, and the reality, which has been that whereas back in the 80s I was writing about predictions that millions would be infected in Europe and elsewhere in time, in fact, today the number of HIV-positive people identified in the UK is still at around the level it was 25 years ago when I began writing about AIDS. It's around 50, 60,000. And this is the case in many and most European countries. And AIDS deaths have actually declined quite substantially from the understanding that millions would be at risk of from this virus that was supposed to be so dangerous because it could spread sexually without one realizing one had been infected. Predictions based on that were that deaths would run into hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in European and North American countries. In fact, the numbers are relatively small. It's not to discount the continuing tragedy of AIDS in those countries, but the numbers in the UK, for example, are something like 200 to 300 deaths from AIDS a year. There's a big mismatch from the original predictions. The public have been led to believe that this big decline in AIDS deaths and the big gap between what had been predicted and what has actually occurred is thanks to the antiviral drug approach. That is the widespread belief today. AIDS is seen as a success story for science, medical science, and the pharmaceutical industry. In Africa and some other parts of the world, many are said to be infected and dying. However, there's a problem there in that although millions are said to be HIV positive, population growth continues at high levels in many of those countries, and this can't be attributed to the drugs because in most instances the drugs are not available on any large scale. So these are problems. My own experience mirrors aspects of this situation. In 1985 to 90, I reported AIDS conventionally. I was working at that time as medical correspondent for the London Sunday Times, and I remember at first being a little bit reserved about some of the idea that a single new virus was responsible for a syndrome that was hitting people so hard and so suddenly. But I went in 1987, I attended the first of the international AIDS conferences that I took part in, was in Washington in the United States. And there I came back a kind of convert. It was almost like a religious rally. There were people demanding drugs outside. There were demonstrations from people, give us the drugs now. Scientists inside the conference were saying, hold on, guys, we're working on it, we've got drugs, we're going to get better ones, and we'll have a vaccine. And because they felt that the cause of AIDS had been identified as this new virus, and therefore, knowing the cause, it wouldn't be too long before a solution was found. Well, that solution has still not been found. When I had been writing, after I had been writing about this for maybe 4 or 5 years, I shifted away from the Sunday Times into a different role, and then went back to the same newspaper a couple of years later, this time working as their science correspondent. And in that 2-year period, perhaps because of wearing another hat, wearing a different pair of glasses, I started to see that the predictions that I had been writing about in the second half of the 1980s were not coming true. The claims that everyone was at risk, which I had written big articles about this, especially when I came back from Washington, that was not being supported by the facts. The condition was remaining confined to the original risk groups identified as a risk right at the very beginning of the epidemic. I came across, quite quickly on my return, I came across a documentary produced by Joan Shenton, who's one of the people who's addressing this event, and it challenged very strongly the understandings that I had lived with and written about for those first few years. It interviewed Dr. Peter Duesberg. It was called AIDS, the Forgotten Voices. It showed that there were some real questions about the HIV theory, but that they had not been put out into public discussion. Peter Duesberg had tried hard to get a debate going, but had been silenced. And it was very interesting later to see some of the internal memos in the Department of Health in the United States, where they were talking among themselves about how can we stop this guy saying these silly things, because this is going to weaken the public health campaign. This was how it was. So I had an opportunity, after initial resistance, to write about these different perspectives, and the Sunday Times published a big 2-page piece called AIDS, Are We Positive? And it was simply an attempt to put out in front of the UK public the fact that there were some different points of view about this. But the response was hysterical. There was a huge amount of criticism of the editor and myself for writing this and for having published it in the Sunday Times, a very important journal in the UK. And for the next 9 months or so, I was unable to write anything more about this subject because the news editor that I worked to was so uncomfortable with the response, all the criticism that this article had brought. But then we had a change of news editor, and the new guy asked me, you know, you did that piece nearly a year ago. What happened? Is there more? And I said, yes, there's more, but I haven't been able to get it into the paper. And this chap was interested, and that gave an opportunity to me to start going into this in depth. The editor of the paper became so interested that he sort of ring-fenced it for me. And although my job was supposed to be covering science in general, it developed almost like I was an HIV/AIDS correspondent. So for 2 to 3 years, I was writing about almost nothing else. And all the papers, all the evidence I could find, I was privy to. This included actually being invited by a virologist at the University of Dortmund in Germany, who had called me after the initial article, to go to his laboratory and learn some of the basics of molecular biology, because this actually turned out to be very useful to me in understanding, I think, where things went wrong. I'd like now to give a little bit more detail of where I think the science went wrong. The key, from the perspective that I now hold, is a little different from the one that Uta mentioned in terms of the meaning of HIV antibodies. The key, I think, is to understand that the HIV test does not specify or even point to the presence of a particular virus. It is a non-specific test that detects raised levels of a variety of protein antibodies commonly found in the blood of AIDS patients, but caused by a variety of conditions. I'll just say that again because it's a rather complex sentence. In the perspective that I now hold, the HIV test is a non-specific test that detects raised levels of a variety of antibodies commonly found in the blood of AIDS patients, but put there by a variety of conditions. There's a group of scientists based in Western Australia who've published a lot of evidence arguing this case, and I've drawn to a considerable extent on their work over a number of years in reaching this conclusion. They argue that in Africa and other parts of the world where poverty is widespread, the main causes, both of testing positive and of the immune system deficiencies currently being described as AIDS, are poverty-linked diseases such as TB, malaria, and other widespread infections. I was actually sent by the Sunday Times at one point, after I'd written an article about this way of thinking, based on a paper published in Biotechnology in the early 90s that challenged the validity of the HIV test. I was sent by the editor to Africa to report from the ground about what was happening there. And I spent about 6 weeks in various countries learning from people on the ground exactly how they perceive things. And I found that although the public statements were often, but we have to believe in this because this is what the Western scientists tell us, and there's so much money coming in line with this, but privately people would often confirm that the picture on the ground was similar to what was being described by this point of view. So in Africa, the situation is that these poverty-linked diseases, TB especially, has been clearly shown to bring about a response from the immune system that puts into the bloodstream these proteins that are liable to be picked up by the HIV test. It's 100% clear, but it leads to all sorts of different theories like co-infection, that HIV makes things worse than TB itself, but actually there's no evidence of that. In the West, the causes, according to this perspective, include the effects of drugs, infections such as hepatitis viruses picked up through needle sharing, repeated transfusions of blood products, such as the haemophiliacs suffered, and exposure to other people's body fluids, especially through unprotected, promiscuous anal sex. According to these scientists, that is a factor affecting some people's risk of developing these raised levels of antibodies, and also potentially a contribution to a condition that can lead on to immune system failure. I'm going to tell you now a little bit about some material that I came across when I was investigating the provenance of where they came from, the HIV test kits. It's really quite amazing. It showed me that from the earliest days, scientists knew about these problems, but they had their reasons for disregarding them, and I'll explain what happened. The first test kits were developed and marketed by US National Cancer Institute scientists at the same time as the HIV paradigm itself was being marketed to the world. The first kits were licensed in March 1985, and France and the UK quickly followed with their own kits. These test kits were introduced primarily, initially, as a means of protecting blood supplies. And in the perspective I now hold, they have validity in that regard, and I'll explain why. But their use in screening surveys, screening populations more generally, gave rise to this idea that hundreds of thousands of Americans and millions of Africans and others were already infected. The tests, it's really important to understand, probably many of you may grasp this, but I'll spell it out for those of you new to this critique of the HIV story. The tests don't look directly for an AIDS virus. They look for HIV antibodies, so-called. These proteins that are thought to be produced by the immune system in response to the presence of the virus. So they don't look for virus directly, but for antibodies signaling the presence of the virus. They do this by bringing a blood sample, a sample of blood serum, which is what you get left after you've filtered out the material that clots, a sample of blood serum from the person being tested into contact with proteins that are believed to be virus components. These are called antigens. These two are brought together, and that should then trigger an antibody-antigen reaction in people who are HIV infected and not in those who are not infected. So that's the current thinking. This could be a valid approach for establishing HIV infection, or at least pointing to HIV infection, if the proteins looked for by the test really did specify HIV's presence. But, this is a crucial but, that has never been shown to be the case. It has never been shown to be the case that the so-called HIV antibodies actually relate to and connect with antigens from this purported virus. None of the proteins used in the tests has ever been shown to be specific for HIV, and therefore to mean that a person is HIV infected. This is astounding, but it's true. They've been presumed but never demonstrated to come from HIV particles. Furthermore, all the proteins used in the tests have been shown by those Australian scientists to have other potential sources, including normal cell constituents released when immune cells become overstimulated and disordered. So there is a meaning in this test. It signals immune system dysfunction, but not the infection with this deadly virus. This is amazingly important in my view. Central to this re-examination of the foundations of the virus theory is evidence that despite early claims to the contrary, it never proved possible to obtain from allegedly infected patients pure particles of the purported virus. That was never done, separate from everything else, with which to validate the tests. And you're going to hear more about this from Professor Etienne de Haven. But purification is essential to know which proteins, as well as which stretches of genetic material, the DNA or RNA, belong to a presumed virus. You must have virus. If the culture materials on which a test is based are not pure, test kits made from such materials will be liable to contain proteins of indeterminate, undetermined origin. I hope you're with me on this. Right from the start, it was known that there were problems on these lines. This is this is material that has never been generally published, but I found through some researches of some very early work sponsored by the World Health Organization. It was known that there were problems on these lines with the HIV tests, but because of political pressures and a general sense of panic about AIDS, regulators allowed the tests to come into use in ways that they knew were inappropriate. It was felt that the public health benefits outweighed the potential disadvantages. Here's some of the material I came across. The quandary was expressed, among others, by Dr. Thomas Zook from the US Food and Drug Administration at a World Health Organization meeting in Geneva as far back as 1986, soon after these kits became available. He said that the first test kits using a technology known as ELISA were licensed as a screen to protect blood and plasma donations. So you see, if these antibodies have some relevance to immune system disorder, and therefore if you use them to screen blood, you will help to screen out potentially dangerous blood. But that says nothing about infection with a specific virus. So they were licensed for that purpose, for screening blood, not as a screen for AIDS or for people at risk of AIDS. Their usage was intended to be limited by phrases to that effect in the package inserts. But, I quote Dr. Thomas Zook of the FDA, enforcing the intent of this language would be analogous to enforcing the Volstead Act, which prohibited alcoholic beverage sales in the United States in the 1920s, simply not practical. So they washed their hands of what was happening in using these tests to tell people that they were infected with a deadly virus, even though the test was never intended or capable of giving that information. Zook said that dictated by public health needs, usage had expanded beyond the indications for which the tests were designed. Broad application was evident among hospital patients, healthcare personnel, and members of groups at high risk of AIDS. The experts there were about 100 people present at this WHO meeting from 34 countries. They heard that though the tests were sensitive enough to safeguard blood supplies, something more was needed to distinguish which people had genuinely been affected with HIV. And Dr. James Allen, Assistant Director for Medical Science at the CDC, AIDS program, he said studies suggested some people were reacting to components of the cell line used to grow HIV for many of the test kits licensed in the US. So there was something that was being used, but as the Australian scientists have said, because because there had never been purification of a particular particle, they were unable to tell which proteins meant what and what came from what. Other reactions occurred because of antibodies to normal cell proteins. He spelled all this out, this understanding. It was all there, naturally occurring in the body. When through immune system activation, we can produce antibodies to our own cell proteins when there's excessive breakdown of our own cells, and that's what some of these antigens were too, not to this purported virus. Allen warned that the problems could be magnified in areas of the world that didn't have the sophisticated facilities of the United States, and that's exactly what happened in Africa and elsewhere. Several delegates spoke of the need for a definitive confirmatory test. They were clear that a commonly used confirmatory method called Western blot was not up to the job. It reduced false positives. Surveys in the US showed that of blood donors who tested positive with the most commonly used ELISA kits, only about 4% were confirmed with the Western blot. But were any of those 4% truly infected? A little bit more just here, because this is so vital, I feel. I'd like you to know a little bit more about the way these tests work. The ELISA kits use a mixture of proteins attributed to HIV. When these react with antibodies in a patient's serum, a colour change results. The first kits of this kind were made from materials obtained from cell cultures thought to be growing HIV and to be constituents of the virus, but it soon became accepted that these materials were not pure virus. They contained these normal cell proteins which confounded the test results and were falsely producing large numbers of positive results. That was the case with the early ELISA tests. That became understood. The Western blot kits are more refined. They use individual test proteins separated along the length of a strip, and these are incubated with the blood to be tested. If the blood contains antibodies to the test antigens, the reactions show up as a series of bands. The problem is that without having pure virus particles obtained from patients at risk or with AIDS to refer back to, nobody is sure which, if any, of the protein antigens selected for use in the tests really come from HIV and therefore signal HIV infection. There's been a huge amount of argument over which proteins should be used and how to interpret the reactions. Montagnier and Gallo, the two pioneers of the HIV story, they differ on this. The same uncertainty surrounds later versions of these ELISA test kits using manufactured proteins. Using recombinant technology, you can produce very specific proteins rather than the soup of materials filtered from cell cultures. These kits overcome the earlier problem of not knowing which antigens were in the kits, but that is not much use when you don't know whether the antigens chosen really belong to HIV. This non-specificity is a problem that has bedeviled AIDS research from the very beginning. There was the head of viral surveillance at the Laboratory Centre for Disease Control in Canada told the meeting that when the proteins from an HIV preparation were separated and stained using ultra-sensitive techniques, more than 30 individual proteins can be recognized. So which of those 30 were viral and which were normal cell constituents? Several large Canadian studies, he told this meeting, that everyone was talking on these same lines, had shown extensive and generalized cross-reactivity, especially in haemophiliacs and in the North American native population. There was a scientist there from the transfusion service in Britain who pointed out that both tests, the ELISA and the Western blot, relied on the same principle of antigen-antibody reactions. He said, "It is important to remember that the Western blot is itself an antiglobulin assay, that is, a test for antibodies. It is liable, therefore, to the same kind of false positive reactions as the screening test it might be confirming." I hope you're getting the point. It's the same principle involved, so it can't be used as a confirmatory test of whatever the ELISA says. It can help reduce the number of false positives, but it is not a confirmation of the presence of HIV. In other words, if there was uncertainty over whether the first test gave valid results, a second test based on the same principle couldn't be used to confirm the other. Dr. Zook was asked if better tests were in the pipeline, and he commented, "Don't hold your breath. One of the difficulties we have in looking at claims for confirmatory tests or designing systems to validate what in fact is going to be confirmatory is determining how you define and validate it." So these guys knew that, but they just felt that they couldn't stop this rolling out of the HIV story. As time went on and the HIV paradigm won worldwide acceptance, increasingly complex procedures for trying to make a reliable diagnosis came into being, including checks for genetic sequences attributed to HIV. But in fact, the basic problem of not being able to validate any of those procedures against pure virus preparations taken from patients still remains. It's amazing. Hope this is coming through to you okay. Is it making some sense to? Thank you. Great. One other thing, I have a little bit more time. One other thing to understand is that there is a strong association between testing HIV positive and the risk of developing AIDS. Evidence to that effect was and still is the main reason why scientists believe HIV is the cause of AIDS. There's never yet been any demonstration of HIV's pathogenicity in the laboratory. But the reason for believing that HIV is the cause of AIDS is that these people who are at high risk of showing these antibodies are also at higher risk of being unwell. But the link is a consequence of the way the test kits were constructed and clinically tested. As we've seen, it never proved possible to validate HIV tests by culturing, purifying, and analyzing particles of the purported virus from patients who test positive, then demonstrating that these particles are not present in patients who test negative. This was despite heroic efforts to make the virus reveal itself in patients with AIDS or at risk of AIDS, in which their immune cells were stimulated in laboratory cultures with a variety of agents, sometimes over many weeks. After the cells had been activated in this way, HIV pioneers selected some of those 30 or so proteins found in the filtered material. It's actually through a high-speed centrifugation process, used it for identifying retroviruses. They found that some of those 30 or so proteins found in that material, gathered at the density characteristic for retroviruses, they selected some of those and attributed some of those to various parts of the virus, but they never presented evidence that these so-called HIV antigens were constituents of a retrovirus particle. Never. So how did they define the proteins as being from HIV? I'll tell you. They did this on the basis of selecting proteins out of those 30 that were most reactive with antibodies in blood samples from AIDS patients and those at risk of AIDS. This means that antigens defined as HIV are being defined as such on the basis that they react with antibodies in AIDS patients. And AIDS patients are then diagnosed as being infected with HIV on the basis that they have antibodies reactive with those same antigens. Do you see? It's a kind of closed circuit of reasoning. There's no need for HIV in this story. It's all working with antibodies, and it's not related to a specific virus particle. That's what happened. The reasoning is entirely circular, which is why Zook was so emphatic that none of the HIV tests were suitable for confirming HIV infection. Isn't it amazing that this is the case? This is material published by the WHO, but in a very obscure book that hardly anybody in the world will have come across, and it's never been picked up on. The tests tell us nothing about whether or not a person is infected with HIV. The tests discriminate between healthy blood on one hand and the blood of patients with AIDS or AIDS-like conditions on the other. That is why they are useful as a screen for the safety of blood supplies. Since AIDS patients suffer a range of active infections and other blood abnormalities, some of which will be transmissible through blood, the tests definitely help to safeguard blood quality. But, in my view, to tell even one person that they are HIV infected on the grounds that they have antibodies that react with the proteins in these unvalidated tests is an unwarranted assault. Manufacturers are aware of this. They include cautious statements in their packet inserts, such as, at present, there is no recognized standard for establishing the presence or absence of antibodies to HIV in human blood. That's there in the small print, but it's disregarded by the zeitgeist. In countries where a single test is commonly all that can be afforded, screening surveys have given rise to the idea that millions are HIV infected. The tests have caused countless individuals to be falsely diagnosed and nations to be deceived into believing that HIV/AIDS is set to decimate their population. I've been pondering for years what it is in human nature that can allow such deception to occur and to be sustained. And some of those understandings about our perception that Utter put before us, especially those ideas from Fleck, were very things that I've come across during this pondering. Money plays a part, of course, but not originally. After a while, something like $200 billion has gone in, from the American taxpayers alone, has gone into HIV/AIDS research and treatment. That carries a lot of people with it, of course. I don't think money is a primary thing. There was concern not to feed into homophobia. When AIDS was first being identified in gay men in New York and San Francisco, it was potentially a big disaster for the gay lib movement, which had fought for the right to assert sexuality in their chosen way for many years and had come a long way from the time in the 50s when homosexuality was listed alongside homicide in medical dictionaries as a kind of pathology. There'd been a shift from that, but AIDS and the problems associated with it, the deaths and the illness associated with it, were threatening the gay lib movement, because as one of the early AIDS patients told me when I was first looking into this and said, but if it's not HIV, what is it? He said he identified how every bout of a sexually transmitted disease was like another blow for gay lib in that small group of gay men who were militantly fighting for the right to assert their sexuality. So they didn't want that to be set back, nor did their doctors. And that was a major factor that prevented open discussion about other possible causes of these problems at that time. I think, personally, that an enormous amount of criticism of those who have dared to question the HIV theory has come from South Africa. President Mbeki looked into this subject intensively. He's a very intelligent guy, but he was universally condemned for having raised any questions, and he suggested that AIDS in his country was poverty-linked. It was immune deficiency linked to poverty. But that was unacceptable to the still white-dominated medical profession there, which had bought into the HIV theory, and he was pilloried really intensely. So was his health minister, a woman who also came to similar conclusions as Mbeki had, that AIDS was not what they were being told. And I think one of the reasons in those circumstances is a refusal, a kind of denial process whereby the white majority that had benefited from 60 years of apartheid in terms of the exploitation of the black population in South Africa, I think there was a reluctance to acknowledge that much of the poverty, the ill health, in some instances the appalling working conditions in the mines and elsewhere that was linked to HIV positivity when these tests started being used, and to excessive rates of illness, that was due to apartheid rather than it became much easier and more comfortable to attribute it to a deadly new virus. But none of those factors seemed enough. There were various contributory factors, but when I learned of Goethe's story of Faust, I felt, wow, this seems to come close to what may lie at the root of this, and it gives us a clue as to what we may need to do to find a way forward, because along with many others, I've been working on this from the point of view of a critic for about 20 years now, nearly 20 years, and we've actually seemingly made very little progress, so some new strategies are needed to be thought about. I feel that what Goethe's story shows us, it goes like this. There's a professor. In Goethe's version of the Faust legend, this professor is very bored with life, and the devil appears in front of him and says, "Hi, I'll give you anything you want. Just make one condition, and this is that you enjoy it, but then let go. If at any point you enjoy something so much that you say, 'Stop, I want to hold on to this, may this feeling never leave me,' then I'm going to have your soul." And this is how the story goes, and it's really quite amazing. what happened in the story as Faust tells it, this professor, he has lots of affairs, he gets lots of money, he gets position and public acclaim. All of this he's able to enjoy and move on. But his downfall comes when, towards the end of his life, he feels he wants to do something good for society. And he buys some land, I think it's reclaimed land, and he builds lots of homes for homeless people. And he feels so great at having done this service that the blessings he's receiving, the joy he gets from feeling that he's done something so good, that he says, may this never end, this feeling of joy, and whoop, there comes the devil to take him at that point. And it's so interesting that Uta brought up Maturana's work, because I saw this quoted by Maturana. He was making the same point that Uta was making, that subjectivity it's not possible to remove subjectivity from our vision. It's actually a kind of denial. We're much better off as scientists or as journalists or as human beings facing the fact that we are going to have certain subjective elements in the way we see the world and trying to monitor them so that we can take them into account rather than pretending that they don't exist. That's when the danger arises. So I think that perhaps if we acknowledge this, we may find a way through this logjam where so many out there are trying their best to deal with a difficult situation, but in the view of this small group of scientists, with wrong-headedness. Gay men's position in the world, I think one of the factors that can help us to go forward is to acknowledge the good that has come from this, albeit a mistake. If we look back at the 50s, even the early 60s, and we see how gay men are regarded in the world today, we see that their position in the world has improved immeasurably. The position of gay people in general in society is hugely accepted and respected now compared with the marginalization and denial and homophobia that used to exist. I think that the HIV story has contributed to this acceptance. This is one good thing that's come from this motive that was present in the construction of the HIV story. Another good thing is that in Africa, we used to say to ourselves, well, yes, millions are dying, that's because it's Africa. But at least the redefinition of those African diseases as HIV/AIDS, albeit a mistake, it has actually focused the world's attention on Africa. I think that the tragedy is that much of the money that goes to Africa is actually being misused because of the wrong thinking surrounding this, but at least it's brought Africa and Africans into our cognizance, into our own lives and worlds. This is also a great step forward, and I think we should try to acknowledge these things, because dissidents, those who question the HIV and its role in AIDS, may find more success if they acknowledge these successes, because then doctors and scientists may be better able to listen to what the science is actually telling them without feeling that their humanity, their feeling of being useful members of society, which most of the people attending these conferences with the huge red ribbon outside here, it's an icon of compassion. If you go and you support that, you're asserting that you are a human being who cares. Those people need to be able to listen to the scientists who have these different perspectives. And if they're acknowledged and respected, they're more likely to be able to hear that than if they're heavily criticized. They are useful members of society. If that feeling is compromised, then they're not going to listen. They're going to continue to not listen. I think this is Goethe, at the end of Faust, apparently speaks of how Faust's soul finally, although he loses his life, his soul is saved by the principle, the eternal feminine. I think the eternal feminine, probably what Goethe means by this, is that sort of forgiveness and understanding and embracing that we're all in this together. We shouldn't marginalize and attack people who disagree with us. Of course, the dissidents have often been marginalized and attacked by the mainstream, so the tendency is to hit back. But in my view, we should try to avoid that if we're going to make a breakthrough and really bring a good result from this. Thank you very much.